The Dark Ages were full of awful diseases ranging from plagues to pestilence and some things that are still kicking around today. Let me know in the comments what you think would be the worst thing to contract, and we'll see if you're correct. I know nobody ever wants to hear about a plague ever again after recent history, but I promise this one isn't your typical version. The Dancing Plague of 1518, or the dance epidemic of the time, was a case of dancing mania that occurred in what is now known as France from July of 1518 till September. The outbreak began when a woman by the name of Frau Trophée began to dance violently in a street for a week straight. Soon, 3 dozen others joined in on the dancing chaos, with the plague claiming 400 victims by August. By early September, the outbreak began to subside, as the dancers were sent to a mountain shrine to pray for absolution. I guess that's where Footloose took inspiration. Exact numbers aren't clear, but a small number of people did pass away from this epidemic, which is pretty wild. Historical documents, including physician notes, cathedral sermons, local and regional chronicles, and even notes issued by the city council, make it clear that victims dance, but they don't know why. There are many theories behind the phenomenon, the most popular being stress-induced mass hysteria. Other theories include ergot, which is a whole other can of worms, and religious explanations. Be interesting to see if this ever pops up again in modern times. Okay, let's go dance, folks. In the medical writings of Europe through the Dark Ages and well into the Industrial Age, tuberculosis was referred to as phthisis, the white plague or consumption, all in reference to the progressive wasting of the victim's health and vitality as the disease took its course. Evidence that tuberculosis and humans have long coexisted comes primarily from studies of bone samples collected from a Neolithic human settlement in the eastern Mediterranean. Genetic evidence gathered from these studies indicates that roughly 9,000 years ago there existed a strain of tuberculosis similar to strains present in the Dark Ages and in the 21st century. Evidence of mycobacterial infection has also been found in the mummified remains of ancient Egyptians, and references to wasting occur in the writings of the Greek physician Hippocrates. The cause in the Dark Ages was assumed to be mainly constitutional, either the result of an inherited disposition or of unhealthy or dissolute living. In the first edition of the Big Encyclopedia, it was reported that a tendency to develop consumption of the lungs could tragically be expected in people who were fine, delicate, and precocious. Based on the stage of the disease, treatments included regular release of red fluids, administration of some fun meds and purgatives, healthy diets, exercise, we're talking vigorous horseback riding, and in the grim final stages, some fun substances. The view that tuberculosis might be a contagious disease also had its, supporters, but it wasn't until 1865 that Jean-Antoine Villemain, an army doctor in Paris, showed that it could be transmitted from ill animals to healthy animals by inoculation. The actual infectious agent was discovered and identified in 1882 by the German physician Robert Koch. By that time, the cultural status of the disease was assured, as summarized by Dr. J.O. Affleck of the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in the 9th edition of that big encyclopedia. Few diseases possess such sad interest for humanity as consumption, both on account of its widespread prevalence and its destructive effects, particularly among the young, causing as much as 1/4 of all deaths in Europe, arising with particular frequency among young adults between the ages of 18 to 35, and bringing on a lingering, melancholy decline characterized by loss of body weight, icky skin, and sunken yet luminous eyes. Tuberculosis was enshrined in literature as the captain of death, the slow killer of youth, promise, and genius. Kinda poetic. A lack of hygiene amongst medieval people led to a lot of horrific skin complaints. Poor people washed in cold water without soap, so this did very little to prevent any kind of infection spread. The more disfiguring skin diseases were generally classed as leprosy, and yeah, that was a doozy, caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, and that could arise from dirty conditions. What does it do? Well, it attacks and destroys the extremities of the body, particularly the toes, the fingers, and the nose. We're gonna start going into head, shoulders, knees, and toes soon, folks. Leprosy was not the only disease that could affect somebody in this way. The affliction known as St. Anthony's fire could also lead to gangrene and convulsions. This condition was caused by a fungus. That good old ergot poisoning I mentioned earlier? That's from rye. So when the grain was ground to make bread, people who ate the bread, they became poisoned. This also had a lot to do with witch hunts at the time as well. One of the most common and lethal diseases suffered by warriors at the time: dysentery. It's a disease that causes inflammation in the lining of the large intestine. The symptoms can include fever and upchuck, but worst of all, it causes debilitating release of innards from the other end. Now, a lot of these diseases were devastating for armies, especially when you were besieging a fortress. The cause wasn't exactly well known, although by simple common sense, a lot of folks tried to avoid camping in the swamps, but sadly, sometimes you couldn't pick where you rested. As a consequence, outbreaks could have huge impacts on battles or wars. One of the reasons the English were so few against so many French in the Battle of Agincourt was that Henry led the terrible siege of Harfleur earlier in the year. His army was decimated by diseases due to the swampy nature of the land, because it had been flooded, and another example saw the same Henry himself die of, yeah, you guessed it. He caught it in the siege of Meaux in 1422, passed away a couple months later, because, well, it kind of weakened him. This disease was really something to take in consideration, but its causes, and those of similar diseases, like typhus, weren't fully understood. That led to very high death rates, and we're talking. Okay, for example, Henry landed in France with 30,000 men in 1450. So after the siege and all the battles, he had 12 to 15,000 men left over. That's a lot. There were regular waves of pestilence or plague throughout this time period, but in 1348, an illness came to Britain that killed a lot of people, even the strong and the healthy, than ever before. It came into Europe from the east, carried by the fleas that lived on black rats. Its signs were a fever, a terrible thirst, and dark blotches under the skin. And that's how it got the Black Death. Almost half the population of Britain died of it. That is, nearly 1.5 million people. Whole villages were wiped out by the disease, or if you survived, you fled. In a lot of villages, there was nobody left to take care of the fields, and then you get the famine, and that kind of kills or drives out whoever's left. You can still see the sites of some of these deserted villages today. At the time, nobody knew what caused the disease, and medicine was powerless against it. People felt hopeless and afraid. They thought this was a sign that God was angry with them. Now, I mentioned this before, but there were many other diseases that devastated a lot of the armies of the Middle Ages. We're talking typhoid now, or camp fever. So during the siege of Antioch in 1098, the Crusaders who were besieging the walled city died in large numbers from typhoid, which broke out in their camp. Not so fun fact coming up. So while most people think of Typhoid Mary and plagues when you hear typhoid fever, turns out nowadays, there's still 11 million cases a year worldwide. Salmonella typhi, the bacterium which causes the illness, and its microbiological relatives cause intestinal and serious systemic illnesses regularly in every country, including the US. So salmonella is a contaminated water and food germ. When it invades the body, it is one of the more ominous infections and one of the more difficult to treat. It can spread into virtually any organ, causing tissue and organ abscesses and necrosis, even infecting arterial vessels, leading to heart valve infection and or aneurysms, with potential to rupture. Furthermore, it is an intracellular invader, making it challenging to get antibiotic weapons delivered into the infected cells to kill it. 20% of untreated typhoid cases die, which is yikes. Just when you thought things were bad? Well, there's a version that's kind of resistant to everything. Salmonella typhi. Increasingly due to the modern reflexive application of antibiotics to fever-associated illnesses, you got a lot of mutations, and it's kind of going nuts. Even the backups for the backups that have been the mainstay for a while to help treat things, yeah, those are starting to lose effect. The English sweating sickness caused 5 devastating epidemics between 1485 to 1551. England was hit the hardest, but on one occasion also mainland Europe, with mortality rates between 30 to 50%. The Picardy sweat emerged about 150 years after the English sweat disappeared in 1718 in France, and it caused 196 localized outbreaks, and then it poofed in 1861. Both diseases have been the subject of numerous attempts to define their origin, but nobody knows. Although both diseases occurred in different time frames and were geographically not overlapping, well, we're still not sure. Diphtheria might be documented back to ancient Egypt and Greece, but severe recurring outbreaks began only after 1700. 1 of every 10 folks infected died from this disease. Symptoms ranged. We're talking severe sore throat, and also then you've got that false membrane covering the larynx, which then you can't breathe. Until treatment became widely available in the 1920s, the public viewed this disease as a death sentence. It wasn't until the 1880s when Dr. Joseph O'Dwyer, a Cleveland native, developed a method of intubating patients, so inserting a tube to keep the airway open to survive the life-threatening phase. Although neither foolproof nor simple to use, at least these instruments comprised a life-saving last resort. And hey, a lot of folks were like, this is a modern medical marvel. Ironically enough, the doctor actually lived long enough to see his invention eclipsed by progress in medical science. It is estimated that smallpox was introduced to Europe between the 5th and 7th centuries, with frequent epidemics during the Dark Ages. The first protection against smallpox consisted in rubbing infectious material from patients with smallpox into the scratched skin of the younger generation. And then we've got a lovely, rich, wealthy lady who brought this method, known as variolation, from Turkey to England in 1721. Albeit dangerous, it was adopted in Europe during the 18th century after the successful treatment of the 2 daughters of the Princess of Wales. By the end of that century, this form of treatment had been widely accepted throughout the world as an effective way to prevent smallpox. Edward Jenner was the first to use cowpox in order to protect against it in 1796. This virus caused only mild infections in humans, but induced an immune response that provided cross-protection against smallpox infection, so it would help. During the more than 60 years the vaccination was carried out from arm to arm, with a certain risk of transmission of syphilis. Yeah, eventually the vaccine was primarily produced on cows for a reason. And finally, arthritis is a disease that's still kind of prevalent today. Examination of 400 Saxon, Romano-British, and medieval skeletons from 7 archaeological excavations in the west of England showed an unexpectedly high incidence of osteoarthritis and osteophytosis. So there was a lot of skeletons that had evidence of an erosive peripheral arthritis. One had gout, one had arthritis. Pretty interesting. The patterns and types of disease were apparently quite different, but it's just neat to see like things that are still around today. And that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.